Napoleon Bonaparte at a diplomatic reception and thought him an attractive, almost handsome man, very unlike the villainous cartoons they had seen in England, in which he had been depicted as a monster. It was therefore all the more of a shock when in May, when they were looking forward to a summer of levees, assemblies and balls, that the armistice came to an end. Napoleon Bonaparte was furious. The war he had intended had come, but too soon. By forcing the issue before his navy was ready, the English had regained half the ground they had lost in the peace. But the English abroad were not to be aware of what their government was doing, and 10,000 tourists were arrested and interned. Such an action, entailing the imprisonment of civilians, was contrary to all civilized precedents, and the British at home were appalled and shocked at this savage action. This, however, was no consolation for the innocent tourists, who found themselves dragged from their houses or the elegant hotels they had rented for the season. It was only because Sir Edward had a friend in the French government that he was warned about what was to happen 12 hours before the edict was put into operation. Hurriedly, he left with his wife and daughter for a house in a small, unfashionable back street, which let rooms to anyone who inquired for them and asked no questions. Unfortunately, while Sir Edward was desperately planning how they could achieve this seemingly impossible and get home to England, he was taken ill. Vernita was convinced that it was the water of Paris that was responsible for his illness. But whatever it was, they had no sooner reached the sanctuary of their boarding house than Sir Edward ran a high temperature. Although his wife and daughter tended him in every way they could, he died suddenly after a week's agonizing pain, leaving them stunned, helpless, and alone. Too late, they realized that they should have risked disclosure and sent for a doctor. Even so, the medical service in France had a bad name, and it was doubtful if even the most experienced physician could have saved Sir Edward. Lady Waltham, who had loved her husband dearly, was prostrate with grief, and it was Vernita who arranged that they should move from the more comfortable apartments they occupied up into the attics. Sir Edward had quite a considerable sum of ready cash on him, since, as soon as he had known that they must go into hiding, he had drawn out the full amount of his letters of credit from the bank. But Vernita sensibly realized that this would not last forever, and as the war before the armistice had been fought for 9 years, she thought with a sinking of her heart that now hostilities were resumed, they might continue for another 9. "We must save every possible penny," she said to her mother. She realized from her mother's helpless response that it was up to her to take the lead and play her father's part in deciding everything they should do. It was obvious that most Frenchmen echoed Napoleon's wrath against the British. Vernita learnt that the Corsican's craving for revenge had made him intent on conquering the race of insolent shopkeepers, as he disparagingly described the British, who barred his way to world domination. The newspapers reported that he was determined to cross the Channel and invade England. "They want us to jump the ditch," he cried, "and we will jump it." Napoleon ordered the construction of hundreds of invasion barges and gunboats to carry an army to England, and mobilized every French seaport. The French thrilled to his vision, and jeered at the British, who thought they could defend themselves against such an armada. However, time passed, and by the beginning of 1805, Napoleon began to realize that his dream of crossing the Channel was fading, while the British Navy blocked the way. But that was not to say that Paris was any more tolerant towards the English. Every time Vernita went out shopping or walked along the streets, she could almost feel the hatred for her countrymen emanating from the victorious French, who had the rest of Europe under their heels. But victories did not stop the price of food from rising, and Vernita was finding it more and more difficult to feed herself and her mother. Lady Waltham had never recovered from the shock of her husband's death, and she seemed to her daughter to be fading away month after month, day after day.